Is the court the last stronghold of justice? We have always believed that justice may be delayed, but it will come to pass. But the reality was different. Sometimes it was late, sometimes it didn't come at all. Justice left in human hands is prejudice. It has been shaken by numerous factors, including fatigue and social background, the lives of countless people in hundreds of years of judicial history. One wrong judgment was destroyed. Even though it is the last straw to realize the justice of the court, the wrong verdict exposes a fatal vulnerability in a human-centered system. A trial is not a simple procedure. It is a momentous event that changes a person's life forever. No one should be wrongly convicted. Now we are facing new possibilities. That's the AI judge. A being who can make consistent judgments based on statistics and data without being swayed by emotions. In this video, we want to highlight the need for AI judges by focusing on shocking judgments around the world. Tragedy in a trial caused by the bias of a human judge. Actual case, 10th day, Central Park. 5 incident, 1989. On April 19, 1989, a white woman was found brutally assaulted in Central Park, New York. This time it caused a shock throughout the United States. Immediately after the incident, police picked up Black and Hispanic teenagers for a quick investigation. Kevin Richardson, Antron, McGray Youssef Salamgori, and now Raymond Santanal have been arrested. They were between the ages of 14 and 16 at the time and were interrogated for long periods of time without a lawyer. The police obtained confessions after up to 30 hours of newspaper interviews, but these confessions contradicted each other and were not related to the time of the crime or the situation at the scene. Yes. Nevertheless, the media hyped it by calling it the time of the beast, and Donald Trump at the time took a full-page ad in the daily newspaper calling for their execution. This social pressure and racial prejudice had a strong influence on the jurors and judges, who were eventually convicted of rape and assault and served a maximum of 13 years. In 2002, the real culprit, Mateus Reyes, confessed and the case was turned upside down. He was already serving time for another rape and murder, and it turned out that his DNA matched the victim's only semen DNA. Since then, New York City has acknowledged responsibility for the wrongful prosecution and investigation, and has paid victims a total of more than $40 million in damages. This case highlights structural racial discrimination in the American criminal justice system. It is a symbolic event that reveals the problems of confession-centered investigation, the violence of the media, and the dangers of political intervention. If AI judges existed, misjudgments based on objective factors such as lack of consistency in confessions, lack of physical evidence, discrepancies between the circumstances of the case and confessions would have been prevented. The Mikasa incident in Tokyo, Japan, 1992. Sugano Takaka, who was 23 years old at the time, was arrested as a suspect in a robbery and murder incident that occurred in Tokyo in 1992. A woman from Rain was stabbed to death in her home, and traces of intrusion by an outsider were found at the scene. However, the police singled out Sugano as a prime suspect simply because he lived in the area. He was subjected to intense interrogation for more than 13 hours without a lawyer, and under coercion and appeasement by investigators, he eventually made a false confession. He sleeps. In his white paper, he outlined his actions on the day of the incident, which was inconsistent with the evidence and confessions from that time. Although the footprints and bloodstains didn't match Sugano's, the court confirmed his guilt based on the confession. Sugano was sentenced to life imprisonment, serving 22 years starting in 2014. A retrial was held when the prisoner confessed to being the real culprit, and Sugano's confession was found to be false. The retrial court recognized the illegality of the inconsistent interrogation procedure and the evidence of lack of credibility of the confession, and found him not guilty. This case exposes structural problems in the Japanese criminal justice system, including the lack of confession-centered protection of victims' human rights and the abuse of police investigative powers. If there was an AI judge, it would have been possible to prevent this misjudgment by statistically analyzing the validity of confessions, whether they were consistent with field evidence, and the temporal consistency of investigation records. On February 6, 1999, a 41-year-old hostess was murdered at a supermarket in Jeonju-gun, Jeonbuk-do. Police? While searching the area on the day of the incident, Seong-yong Kim Kyung-an, a young man in his early 20s who lived nearby, was identified as a suspect. The three men were arrested without any evidence, only because they were in the vicinity of the crime scene and had a criminal record. During the investigation, the police interviewed them without sleeping for a long time. Physical threats and threats followed. In the end, in extreme fear and exhaustion, the young man made a false confession, and the contents of the confession contained statements that contradicted each other or contradicted the initial investigation. Even CCTV and witness statements supported that they were not the culprits, but the police and prosecutors ignored this and relied solely on confessions to prosecute. The court found confessions as the only evidence of guilt. Each of the three men was sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison. They had to spend part of their youth in prison, stigmatized by society as murderers. However, in 2003, another inmate, Mr. Zhao, confessed to being the real culprit, and the circumstances and field evidence at the time of the crime were exactly consistent with his statement. As a result, the case was reinvestigated. 3. The young man was found innocent and rehabilitated. This case is a representative case that clearly shows the multi-layered problems in the Korean judicial system, such as false confessions induced through confession-centered investigation, torture and threats, and ignoring evidence. If there was an AI judge, the consistency analysis of confessions, CCTV and alibi data, the time of interview, and the psychological state of the victim were comprehensively judged, and the unjust conviction would not have been handed down. Now, the Birmingham 6 incident, England, 1975. On November 21, 1974, 2 Buffer 147 and New X-Rock bombings in the central English city of Birmingham, England, resulted in a disaster in which 21 people were killed and more than 180 were injured. Immediately after the incident, British police were asked to investigate quickly. The IRA has arrested Kellen Patrick, Richard Megill, Kenny, William Power, John Walker, Gerard Hunter. The police subjected them to severe physical violence and forced them to press newspapers for long periods of time. They were threatened with guns. He was repeatedly beaten without sleep, and as a result, he eventually made a false confession. All of the questions were informal and were not recorded or recorded. The police prepared an investigation report based on the confession, and the court accepted the confession as key evidence, even though the evidence found at the time of the incident did not match the contents of the confession. The trial proceeded very quickly amid political pressure and public anger, and the 6 were convicted in 1975, and each sentenced to life in prison. They persistently maintained their innocence while serving time and complained that the confession was made by torture. However, the British judicial authorities did not accept their claims for a long time. In 1991, 16 years after the incident, an independent judicial review and an internal investigator's declaration of conscience, tampering with evidence and illegal police investigations. As it increased, a retrial finally opened. All Birmingham 6 were acquitted and released. This incident shocked British society and was an opportunity to expose the harm of judicial reform, securing the independence of investigative agencies and confession-based investigations. If an AI judge had been in charge of this case, he would have been able to accurately detect inconsistencies between confessions and on-site evidence, human rights violations in the newspaper environment, and the possibility of manipulating investigation records to prevent unfair convictions. This is the most stark example of why we need technology-based judgment that is not swayed by human emotions and pressures. Oh, the American William Dillon case. In 1981, a woman was brutally murdered near Indian Lanty Beach in Florida. Soon after the incident, a man named William Dillon was arrested as a suspect. At the time, he had no relationship with the victim and had an alibi that he was spending time on the beach with friends at the time of the incident. But investigators charged Dillon based solely on an anonymous tip that he was last with the victim. The police tried to solve the case without physical evidence, and the decisive. What was presented as evidence was the false testimony of a third party who was in custody at the time. This witness was later revealed to have made a deal with the prosecution to convict Dillon. Another key piece of evidence was the use of police dogs for scent surveillance, a method that has no clear scientific basis and has not been recognized as legally binding in many US states. Despite one piece of evidence, the jury found Dillon guilty. He served 27 years. In prison, he constantly maintained his innocence, and with the support of the American Civil Liberties Foundation's Dyson Project, DNA testing was conducted on evidence related to the 2008 incident. The results were shocking. The DNA found at the scene of Dillon's murder was not a match at all, and was instead found to be a match for a third person. As a result, he was released after 27 years, and has since received about $1.3 million in compensation from the state of Florida. This case is a good example of how evidence lacking scientific credibility and transactional testimony can lead to dangerous verdicts in the US justice system. If an AI judge intervened, he would accurately review the reliability of testimony, the validity of scientific evidence, alibi information, etc., and make a judgment that was not swayed by strong emotions or public opinion. 6 French Patrick Dera, Incident 2001. In 2001, a shocking incident occurred in a small town in France. Patrick Dera was an ordinary bus driver, living a quiet life with his wife and 3 children. But one day, his wife and 3 children are found murdered in his home. Because he was the only survivor, the police. From the initial investigation, Dera was identified as a strong suspect. The media covered the incident extensively, portraying Dera as a quiet monster, and the police questioned him only because his emotions were too calm. In fact, Dera was in a state of deep shock and post-traumatic stress, but investigators interpreted this as the killer's composure. He spoke to Joe about whether he killed his family because of his confused mental state under repeated newspaper and pressure. "I wasn't sure, and I ended up saying maybe I did." This statement was immediately recorded as a confession, and in court his reaction was interpreted as an indirect confession, which became the core of the conviction. The evidence was very poor, and no trace of Dera was found in the fingerprints or bloodstains of the crime tools. At the time of the incident, his movement route or phone records were not properly investigated, and the prosecution only gave emotional reactions and vague confessions. Indicted, he was eventually sentenced to life in prison for murdering his wife and child. But a decade later, another man in prison confessed to being the real culprit, and his DNA matched traces found at the crime scene. As a result, Dera was released, and French society was shocked. Dera suffered great mental and physical damage in prison, and in addition to the trauma of losing his family and the time he endured an unfair conviction, he left a scar that cannot be recovered with any compensation. If there was an AI judge, he would have comprehensively judged that Dera's confession was made in psychological confusion, the lack of scientific evidence, whether there was an alibi in digital data, media influence, and the possibility of a public opinion trial. Fact-based analysis, not emotion, may have been our last chance to uphold justice in this case. Korea. On August 10, 2000, an incident occurred in which a taxi driver was stabbed to death by a weapon in Yakcheon-hogori, Iksansi, Jeonbuk-do. At that time, the police urgently arrested a 15-year-old middle school student. Army A denied the crime, but the police repeated the coercive newspaper without putting the heat to sleep close. Frightened Army eventually made a false confession. He was investigated alone without his parents. There was a clear culprit in this case. Mr. B, a motorcycle driver who fled the scene of the incident, was seen, and CCTV of nearby shops and resident statements also pointed to Mr. B. But the police ignored this and focused on investigating only Group A. At that time, The court sentenced Army A to 10 years in prison without any physical evidence other than a confession, and he spent his youth in a prison for years. 6 years later, in 2006, the real culprit B confessed after being arrested in another powerful case, but the prosecutor ignored it and closed the case again. Afterwards, Army A maintained his innocence and persistently requested a retrial. Finally, in 2016, the Supreme Court opened a retrial and found him not guilty. This case is a structural error in the Korean justice system, juvenile delinquency. This is a case that clearly exposes the confession-centered practice of human rights violation investigation agencies. If AI judges existed, they would have been able to comprehensively analyze the victim's age investigation record, the credibility of confessions, and the existence of CCTV and digital evidence to prevent the tragedy of innocent teenagers being accused of being criminals. In 1986, a shocking incident occurred in Texas, USA, in which a woman was found murdered in her apartment. Within hours, police arrested 21-year-old Anthony Ray Hines, who was discovered by chance nearby. He was on the Dragon Line simply because he had a previous history of misdemeanors and was roaming the neighborhood. Hines was arrested by police without a lawyer. I was transferred again, and I received a long, overbearing newspaper. He was poorly educated and mentally unstable, and was dragged around by investigators' lead questions, eventually leading to a false confession. The circumstances of the crime he described did not match the evidence at the actual crime scene, but the police ignored this and relied solely on confessions to press charges. Even at the scene, no trace of Heinz's DNA or fingerprints was found, and the victim and Heinz didn't know each other at all. The prosecution charged him with first-degree murder without any physical evidence other than his confession, and the court emphasized the authenticity of his confession to the jury and sentenced him to life in prison. Heinz served 30 years in prison, complaining of injustice, and the case was long forgotten. However, in 2015, with the help of a project launched by the Texas Criminal Justice Foundation, a DNA re-examination of the evidence stored at the time of the incident was carried out, and as a result, it was revealed that he was innocent. The DNA found on the victim's body matched a completely different person, and Heinz was released in 2016. This case is a prime example of the dangers of confession-based investigations and how harsh the justice system can be on the less educated or socially disadvantaged. If the AI judge was in charge of this case, he would never have made an unfair conviction by comprehensively analyzing objective factors such as the consistency of the confession, the existence of physical evidence, and the inconsistent newspaper environment at the scene. The Amanda Knox case, 2007, November 2007. In Dahlia Perusa, British student Meredith Kutcher, who was the roommate of American student Amanda Knox, was found strangled to death inside their shared apartment. At the time of the incident, Knox was with her Italian boyfriend Rafael Solesto, who claimed an alibi that night. However, in the initial investigation, the police identified Wrongful as a possible suspect, without specific physical evidence such as fingerprints or DNA. The problem was that from the beginning of the investigation, the police established the premise that Knox was the culprit based on his psychological state and his words and actions. The fact that she was still laughing with her friends after the murder was distorted as psychopathic behavior, and police briefings leaked to the press during the investigation portrayed Knox as a transgender murderer. The media took this as it is, and not only Italy, but also the United States and Britain, also called it rust. Public condemnation has grown. Police claimed that Knox was jealous of the victim and conspired with Italian bartender Rudy Good to kill her. Knox was forced to make contradictory statements by psychological pressure after a long newspaper, and the prosecution, considering this as a confession, indicted her and her tagline, Cheeto, the Court of Justice. Both men were convicted on circumstantial evidence alone. Knox was sentenced to 26 years, and Necito was sentenced to 25 years. However, the appeal later revealed that all the physical evidence was directed to Rudy Good's sole crime, and that only his DNA and fingerprints were detected at the crime scene. The DNA of Knox and Sulicito was not found on any of the tools of the crime or around the victim's body, and their confessions have lost credibility due to the coercive nature and procedural illegality of the party. In 2015, the Italian Supreme Court ruled that he was not guilty. This case illustrates the fact that speculative media reports can be emotional and illogical, based on circumstances that can destroy an individual's life. If there were AI judges, they would only make judgments based on scientific evidence and logical connections, and would not be influenced by media reports or public opinion. It is likely that a fair verdict was given. On 17th of August 1980, a chainworm family was camping in Ururu-Yergelock National Park in the Northern Territory of Australia, when their baby Azaria chainworm disappeared inside a tent. The mother, Lindy Chainworm, immediately shouted that the dingo had taken the baby, and nearby campers watched the dingo leave the tent. I witnessed the scene. However, the police doubted this claim and the case gradually developed into a murder case. In the initial investigation, there were traces and animal footprints around the tent that appeared to be dragged. The police recorded it incorrectly and took Lindy's statement with a mocking look. In Australian society, there was little concept of being able to attack a person or take a child, and religious and cultural prejudice also came into play in that Lindy was a Gentile and a suzerain during her 7th year. Since then, Lindy has developed an image as a strange mother because she seems emotionally cold, and the press has started to cast her as a psychopath who murdered her baby. The police prosecuted Lindy based on what was believed to be bloodstains in the tent. The court recognized this evidence as scientifically insufficient and sentenced Lindy to life in prison. She was imprisoned in 1982 and had to give birth in prison the following year. However, in 1986, Azaria's clothes were found almost intact in the Dingo cave near the scene of the incident, and the clothes had sharp animal teeth marks. As a result of this evidence, Lindy was released and her conviction was officially overturned in 1888. In 2012, the Australian coroner finally concluded that Dingo's death was true through an official investigation. This case starkly illustrates how social prejudice, media trials, and misinterpretation of scientific evidence can turn a mother into a murderer. If AI judges existed, evidence-based analysis, rather than emotion, and public opinion, such as field trace analysis, water attack case data results, could prevent misjudgment through perceptual reliability evaluation.